welcome to episode 186 of Cinematary. I'm your host, Zach Dennis, and I am here with
Andrew Swafford
and Lydia Creech.
And in today's episode, we will be talking about movies we saw this week in part 1. And in part 2, we will be beginning our new series titled Tennessee Auteurs. We're going to be starting with 1949's Intruder in the Dust. We're putting this in the series as kind of our first leg because it's directed by Clarence Brown. Clarence Brown, while he was born in Massachusetts, he moved and grew up in Knoxville, Tennessee. He graduated high school in Knoxville, and he got his bachelor's from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. So, it relates to us in a good way.
That's where we're from, yeah. And, people who have gone to University of Tennessee, Knoxville know that there's the theater there that's named after Clarence Brown. So that's kind of the Hollywood's big stamp of Knoxville comes from Clarence Brown in a lot of ways.
Yeah. So which we have a guest for that discussion, Dr. Charles Hannon comes on and chats with us to talk about the novel, which is by William Faulkner, as well as the film. And so we just wanted to preface that there's not a lot of Clarence Brown discussion in that part. It's more about kind of the content of and I think it's more of a wide ranging discussion of just the South in general more than just Tennessee.
And
so
that seems like it's going to be increasingly relevant as we keep moving through these movies. A lot of them, even though they're made by people from Tennessee, they're set in other parts of the South, or they're not set in the South at all, but they're always kind of dealing with certain issues related to the South, even if it's not specifically Tennessee related. You can definitely feel the cultural perspective that they were brought up in, like being expressed in those movies.
Definitely. Yeah. But let's go ahead and talk about movies that we saw this week. We're going to start out with a movie that I fumbled through last week, and that's Annihilation. Because now I have two people who actually saw the movie and can so just a big warning, if you have not seen the movie and you don't want it spoiled, we're going to be very spoiler heavy compared to my rambling last week. So
if you don't want Annihilation spoiled for you, skip forward like 10 minutes or so. Maybe we'll be talking about Game Night, which is much less spoilable. Or is it?
I don't know. Somebody on our review of it on the website was mad that we spoiled it. So who knows?
Yeah, that's true.
But Annihilation, it's like I said last week, it's written and directed by Alex Garland. It's based on the novel of the same name, and it follows this biologist played by Natalie Portman who joins this kind of, for lack of a better word, Suicide Squad. It's a better Suicide Squad movie than Suicide Squad was. Who go on this expedition into this kind of area of land in Florida that has kind of had this kind of enigmatic, it's this enigma known as the Shimmer, and they go in to find more out about it because all of the teams that have gone in so far have not come back except for Oscar Isaac, and Oscar Isaac comes back in a very weird way, very different from how he was initially, and so that's what brings Natalie Portman into the fold, because she plays his wife. But yeah, Andrew and Lydia, you guys caught it this week. I talked about it way too long last week, so give me your thoughts on Annihilation.
Lydia, what do you think?
I think it's very pretty. I appreciate.
Good start.
I appreciated the kind of sci-fi aesthetic. The idea of the Shimmer and what it does, and what Natalie Portman and her team of scientists. Sorry, I don't learn any character names if I know who the actor is.
Well, they're not particularly memorable names as far as I remember.
Discover in the Shimmer, a lot of it is really visually striking and kind of cool, but overall it was kind of dumb. I can see why you wanted to talk about it, Zach, because I was left feeling a little bit, confused, or, I think I understand what the movie was doing, but I don't know. Maybe it wasn't worth it, or maybe I didn't understand.
What do you think is...
Can we at least, do you guys understand why I was I don't want to spoil it, but I also don't know how to talk about it without spoiling it?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. I'm vindicated a little bit. That's fine. Andrew, what did you think of the movie?
Yeah, I completely agree that you can't talk about this movie without spoiling it, because all of the positives that I have to bring to the table about this movie are very much reveals that happen later on in the film. Like, there are two specific sequences that I was very gripped and shaken by. One involving a bear that has a human
quotation
voice,
marks,
and another involving a weird, what do you call it? I'm forgetting the name of this word. It is this humanoid figure that has a rainbow-esque tint to everything. The entire figure is like this one like unified element. This is very hard to talk about because it's like surreal imagery, right? But the sequence in which Natalie Portman is just stuck in a room with this being was just terrifying to me, and I felt very struck by many of the images in the movie, especially this like hypnotic, kaleidoscopic, almost 3D, multicolored thing that she sort of falls into visually near the end of the movie, that I think is why people are making references to 2001 and things like that. I thought that all that was just dazzling to behold and very scary at times. And I don't think that the movie is dumb. Like, I think that has a lot on its mind, and I think that what it's dealing with thematically is really interesting personally, but I think that the movie really fumbles on a lot of the basics. Just basic storytelling structure, basic character identity and motivation. You have this team of 5 women who are all essentially interchangeable. I mean, there's a sequence where one of the women explains the backstories of all the other women, so that's great storytelling. And then you never really get any more from them aside from that one character trait that you got kind of rattled off as a laundry list to you. And then the characters just kind of die one after another. It feels a lot like a slasher movie in that respect. I know that in the book, these characters don't even have names. They're just referred to as the biologist and the psychologist and all this stuff. And I feel like you might as well just call them like the blonde and the brunette, because like their identities don't matter. They don't bring their scientific prowess to the table, really, aside from pointing out, oh, this looks like 2 different species, which is something that I could have told you. They just kind of exist as stops along the way to get picked off so that Natalie Portman can be this final girl. And again, be this final girl in a sequence that is really harrowing and visceral, but I don't think that the character is there. I don't care about her. I don't understand her backstory. It seems like there's a bunch of unnecessary stuff tacked onto her character, like a flashback involving an affair that doesn't need to be there at all. Like, it just feels like on a fundamental level, this movie is like failing to tell an actual story, but it has all these ambitions and all of these like dazzling sequences. So it reaches where most movies don't even try to reach, but it also, again, like fails at the basics. Sorry, I interrupted you like 3 times, Zach. Go ahead.
No. I'm glad. I'm glad that you mentioned that it kind of fails at the basics, because that's something I was trying to get to in a sort of way last week, where that's one of the takeaways I had, where it seemed like these characters were just kind of basic, like they were just kind of stock characters. And I don't know, I didn't want to say that necessarily, because I know I've seen a lot of people who kind of are almost get a little defensive about that reading of the characters in the film, but and I don't think that that's something that's more on Alex Garland than Tessa Thompson and Gina Rodriguez and Jennifer Jason Leigh and these, because I think that all the actresses in it are fantastic. It's just I don't know if I agree with that personally. I did not love the acting in this movie, especially from Natalie Portman. We're going to talk in part 2 about
Hollywood films that have black characters and don't give those black characters a whole lot to do, but sometimes the actors bring a lot to the table just with their body and their face, right? And kind of add more dimensions to their character than the script allows. And I feel like Natalie Portman had an opportunity to do that because the script does not really give you that deep of a look at who she is. But she still acts it kind of as a blank. And I'm also thinking about this in the context of, apparently in the second book in the series, it is revealed that this protagonist is Asian.
What?
I don't know why they don't reveal that in the first book of the series, but they do. And I'm just thinking of okay, so Natalie Portman does not do an awesome job at this, in my opinion, even though I love her in a lot of other things. I think she's amazing in Jackie. I think she's amazing in Black Swan. I was underwhelmed by her blankness here, and I was wondering, surely there's an Asian actress who would have been A, willing to play this part, and B, would have brought a whole lot more dimension to this character than she does. It just felt very blah to me.
I'll make the point that has also been made. When this book was when the movie was optioned and all that stuff, the second and third books had not come out, so
they
wasn't
out. Yeah, Alex Garland didn't know.
Alex Garland had no idea.
I'm not trying to throw him under the bus. Yeah. I'm just saying I was underwhelmed by Natalie Portman.
There's a very good piece about the representation and Annihilation in Vulture if you'd like. That's one of the things I know a lot of people have pointed out. But it was one where the books had not all come out by the time the movie was started being made. But I'm glad also though that you made the point about that last sequence, the kind of cerebral sequence with Natalie Portman's character, because that's the one point where I was very much locked in there. I was just kind of transfixed into on the screen, because first you have that kind of almost 3D-ish effect happening, but then when you have that humanoid person, crawl, following her and then literally suffocating her against that door, that was just one of the most. I wasn't it took another level because it wasn't a jump scare, but it was just more of a sinking through my body terror, because I could just feel that suffocation of somebody just completely encompassing your space and your person all in that one. It was just, I know
we have a review of this movie coming out on Monday by Jordan Collier, and he has this term that I love called deal with it horror. And I think that the last sequence in Annihilation is deal with it horror. It just kind of puts you in a room with this thing and makes you stay there for a little while. And by the way, the word I was trying to think of earlier to describe that figure was iridescent. It is like an iridescent humanoid being. It's just very unnerving. Reminds me of Silent Hill games or something like that. And in another way, Under the Skin, which I think you mentioned last week as well, Zach. So
that's the sequence that lost me.
Really?
Yeah. I didn't understand what was happening, and therefore it wasn't scary to me. I got too caught up in the mechanics, I think, of what's going on, why is this going on.
But you've parsed it out now, right?
Yes, but it still didn't make it effective in the moment.
Oh man, I didn't feel like I even needed to understand. I was just being very affected by it, and also thinking to myself I saw Mother last year, but maybe this is the weirdest thing I've seen in a mainstream theater with an audience of moms. I could not imagine what the general consensus of like how the audience was reacting to that sequence was.
I kind of had like not a great. I went and saw this in a theater where it's one of the it's like structured where you sit at a seat and then like people like come and serve you food and stuff. So first off, I'm getting I had like food with me and I'm eating and watching this movie, and Oscar Isaac cuts the guy's stomach open and that thing is, like squirm. And I was like, well, I guess I'm done with food now. And so I just put that, so I just didn't eat anymore. I was like, I'm done now. And so,
I don't like food
anymore.
Yeah,
and then too, when that sequence is happening, I kind of like, I was just like drawn to the screen, but I was kind of like you, Andrew. I was going like, what are all these people thinking? Like, because I'm in a full house theater, and they're just, and I can't imagine what everybody is taking in when this is all happening, because I'm kind of, I don't understand what's happening. I didn't understand what was going on, but it scared the living shit out of me.
Yeah. So, Lydia, why did you think it was dumb? Like, what's dumb about it?
I don't think it was actually managing to communicate or do anything with the ideas that it had started to posit. Because leading up into the Shimmer, or while they're in the Shimmer or whatever, there's a lot of talk about like corruption of DNA and refraction and all these different separate entities being reduced or combined into one, which led to, like I said, some like really cool visual things with animals and plants and human beings. But then I just didn't understand what it was doing with it. Like, Natalie Portman has a tattoo from another character, and then from a third character, apparently I wasn't paying that close attention. And like, there's an idea there, and it's kind of cool, but I didn't understand it, and I don't enjoy watching science fiction that makes me feel dumb when I'm pretty sure it's its fault.
Yeah, I do think that the movie tries to get across its ideas in the most obtuse way possible. It is not intuitive storytelling, not traditional storytelling. And in a way, it feels like I'm being a bad cinephile and criticizing the movie for that, because, like, don't you want unconventional storytelling? Don't you want people to break the mold a little more? But I don't think that this is doing like a really edgy, like 2001 Under the Skin sort of like,
yes,
we're telling the story our way. I feel like it's just kind of cobbled together kind of messily in a lot of ways.
Like, if it's going for just pure spectacle, that's fine, and it does deliver that. But when I got distracted, like, why does this phosphorus grenade thing work? What is the other thing made of? Why does it catch on fire? Why doesn't she catch on fire? Like, that's a problem.
I wasn't concerned about
I shouldn't
that
be
kind of like
falling down those threads.
I wasn't going down those like world building rabbit holes, really. I was just more thinking about the story as like a structured narrative. You know, you have this really convoluted lead up to her entering the Shimmer, which is like 30 minutes of various meetings with people, and a really odd reunion scene with her supposedly long lost husband, who we just learned was long lost like 30 seconds previously. So I feel like all of that stuff is kind of extemporaneous. You could cut it out. The movie could start with her going into the Shimmer, and we can kind of get the backstory through just immersion. And then there's the random flashbacks to like her talking to Oscar
We're already
Isaac.
in a flashback, for the record.
Yeah, and we are in a flashback because we also have the interrogation scene, which is framing the movie, which Jordan talks about in his piece, is a really lazy storytelling trope. It did not work in Atomic Blonde. It does not work here. Like, cut the interrogation scene, cut the flashbacks, cut the lead up. Make it a horror movie. She goes in the Shimmer. She goes to the lighthouse. She comes back. She's a different person when she comes back. That is like really economical storytelling.
Well, I'll in defense of that, and let me preface that I 100% agree with you. But I think I just as somebody who knows this was a movie that got cut off the slate internationally to be released in theaters. It's on Netflix, and it made no money here in the States, and it's probably going to be on Netflix in a month or so. I know that the studio was concerned deeply with what this was, and they were like, people aren't going to get this. So I feel like some of that was Alex Garland, having to make a concession with the producers to make it, quote, more whatever to the general public, because I agree, those are muddled and make no sense to me, and I would have just started with the Shimmer and let's go from there. But
I think, I'm trying to look from the the studio's perspective here and like what exactly is confusing about the movie. I think that what's confusing about the movie is like all the layers of narrative threads that try to explain what's happening in the movie. I think that if you were just immersed in the world of the movie, it would feel like things would kind of intuitively reveal themselves to you. Like make it this just like lizard brain, like physical trek into the wilderness kind of thing. And I think it would work on just a thriller level that audiences could get behind. But as it stands now, it's just kind of a weird,
I think having
amorphous thing.
I also think the comparisons to 2001 and Under the Skin are a huge disservice. Like trying to reach those levels of, I don't know.
I agree. It's whenever
metaphysical, like it doesn't get there.
Whenever something comes out, it's like we have to qualify with comparisons to stuff like that, and then I think that kind of ruins. I agree. I wish I wish that wouldn't happen. All right, Andrew, game night.
All right, people who are skipping Annihilation spoilers, welcome back. Let's talk about a movie that's a little less heady, but even better. Game Night is a new action comedy that is by the directors of some really bad movies, including the Vacation remake. This is by John Francis Daly and Jonathan M. Goldstein. I did not see the Vacation remake, but I've heard from people on Twitter, like Scott Weinberg, for example, as much as they hated that movie is the exact amount that they love this movie. And I don't know how they've managed to make that turnaround, but there it is. Game Night stars Jason Bateman and Rachel McAdams as the two central performers. They are introduced very economically, like in this opening title sequence, as a couple that has come together over their lust for competition and just bloodthirstiness in the world of games and competing for dominance in various avenues. So they meet at a trivia night. The title sequence concludes with their wedding, which their first dance is like a Dance Dance Revolution contest. And the movie then kind of reveals itself to be a whodunit because they go to a murder mystery game hosted by Jason Bateman's brother, played by Kyle Chandler from Friday Night Lights. And in this murder mystery game, it becomes very clear early on that it is unclear what in the murder mystery is a planned act of fakery and what is actual crimes that are being committed in front of the characters, and they do not know which one is which makes for a lot of great dramatic irony, a lot of layers to this narrative, unpredictable plot that is yet very tight, very scripted, very well wound. I would compare it in a way, I don't think it's as good as this movie, but the script is kind of similar to Get Out in the way that every tiny detail that gets introduced in the first half of the movie kind of comes back and becomes very important in the second half of the movie. It feels like no minutes are wasted. There's no fluff of improv here. I would also compare it to the comedy of Edgar Wright and how visual it is. This is a movie, I heard somebody on Twitter talk about it as, this is proof that a comedy can be verbal and visual at the same time. Like, this movie is full of great lines, but is also full of sight gags and camera tricks that make those lines even funnier. The one thing that I'm thinking about that's maybe easiest to communicate is a scene where somebody is trying to bribe someone from across a desk. And so they are slowly sliding across dollar bills across the desk to try and entice them to give them some secret information. And the camera is like holding very tightly on the desk, and you're seeing this huge dollar bill like slowly come into frame. And the joke is like you realize how small of an increment of money this actually is. Like, he first starts by slowly sliding a $10 bill across the desk, and that doesn't quite do it. So then he slowly slides a $5 bill across the desk, and the bills get smaller and smaller, and he ends up getting them $17, which is not a good bribe amount. But the directors continually use the framing and use the focus to just over dramatize just how ridiculous this amount of money is. And I think that the attention to craft kind of comes through in the music as well. Like, this movie has a really hilariously, ironically over-the-top score by Cliff Martinez, who does the Nicholas Winding Refn scores. And this sounds like a Nicholas Winding Refn movie of like those really nocturnal, arpeggiated synths. They're just like really serious and menacing. And yet you're watching this goofy thing. And, you know, in a way, it's like shot like a David Fincher movie at times. There are sequences that remind me of that weird CGI float through the kitchen in Panic Room that we talked about last year. There's a sequence that is alluding to Michael Mann's Heat. Like, this is a really like well-read cinematic comedy that is just way better than it has any right to be honest. And I was delighted by it and continually laughed at it and never knew where it was going. And it's a kind of studio comedy that we haven't seen in a while. I mean, there's been some stuff recently that I loved a lot in the kind of improv hangout vein, like Girls Trip, for example, or Central Intelligence, or a couple of other things, Keanu 2 years ago. These are all really good scripted movies as well that had a sense of like airiness and bubbliness about them. And Game Night is kind of on the other end of the spectrum, while being as good as those movies and just like how much of like a steel trap it is and how it's constructed. And I think all of the actors do an incredible job too. Like, this is the perfect kind of role for Jason Bateman, where he can be just the right amount of like a jerk ass and not necessarily have to be sympathetic. And the movie reminds us that Rachel McAdams is an amazing comedy talent. I'm sure people have heard that there's a scene where she sings Third Eye Blind to a loaded pistol, which is a lot of fun. And I don't want to say too much about this actor, but Jesse Plemons, who's, you know, Kyle Chandler's co-star in Friday Night Lights, has the most scene-stealing role in this movie that I again don't want to give away too much about. But you've never thought about Jesse Plemons as you probably never thought about him as having a comedic persona before, but man, does he in Game Night. This is a really surprising, you know, unexpected treat that I think that people should not pass up while it's still in theaters. It's really fun.
Very cool. Yeah, it is still in theaters now. So yeah, I guess if you've already seen Black Panther, you can go see Game Night. Because those are the only two it seems like you're going to be seeing at the movie theater. All right.
Annihilation. I guess that.
No, it's going to be gone soon.
It's gone.
All right. Well, we're going to take a short break. We will be back talking 1949's Intruder in the Dust with Dr. Charles Hannon after this.
Hey, Cinematariats. This is your co-host Lydia Creech with an important message during this break in the show. Cinematary would like you to know that we do not want your money, and we don't want to place ads in the show at this time either. That's not why we do this. We do it because we enjoy each other's company, and we want to bring you our pure, unadulterated opinions on the world of cinema. However, there are a few things you can do to help out the show that we would greatly appreciate. First, leave us a review on iTunes, 4 or 5 stars only, to help us reach more listeners per the algorithm gods. Secondly, send us a tweet at Cinematary, or better yet, send us an email at zach@cinematary.com. That's Zach, Z-A-C-H, so we can hear from you guys for a change. I'd especially like to hear if you're a human and not an android who also likes Blade Runner, or maybe you have a suggestion of a movie you would really like to hear our opinions on. Regardless, let us know your thoughts and we will read them out and respond to them on future episodes of the show. Finally, please share the show with friends and members of your family who you think would enjoy listening to and participating in our film discussions that we bring to you guys every week. So, to recap, review, send us your thoughts through Twitter and email, and please share with your friends and family. We would greatly appreciate it. Thanks for listening. Now back to the show.
are back with part 2 of episode 186 of Cinematary. In this part, we will be beginning our Tennessee Auteurs series with 1949's Intruder in the Dust. This comes from director Clarence Brown, from a screenplay by Ben Maddow. It's adapted from the 1948 novel by William Faulkner. And joining us today to talk about the film, the book, and kind of everything in between is Dr. Charles Hannon. Dr. Hannon, thank you so much for coming on and chatting with us about this.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So I guess before we kind of dig into the discussion, can you give the listeners at home a brief little overview of your history with this novel and this movie and all of that?
Sure. Yes, I did my PhD in English from 88 to 94 at West Virginia University, and was writing my dissertation on William Faulkner, and probably in 91 or 92, took a trip to Oxford, Mississippi to learn more about that place, and found myself poring through microfilm of the Oxford Eagle newspaper, the local newspaper in Oxford, Mississippi, from the whole period that Faulkner was writing and working, and somewhat before as well. And one way or another was interested in Intruder in the Dust. I knew that they had filmed the novel there, and so I started looking for newspaper articles about that history, and just got kind of interested in the connections between the novel and the cultural moment of filming that on location there in Oxford, Mississippi.
I know that you cover a lot about kind of that whole process of filming in Oxford, and we'll definitely go back to that. I want to start real quick though. Early on in the piece that you wrote about this film, you talk about the film as, or just kind of film as a vehicle for the fantasies of the South's dominant classes. And you talked about kind of MGM viewing Intruder of the Dust as this third leg in this Southern trilogy that started with Birth of a Nation in 1915, and then it continued on with Gone with the Wind in 1939. Can you kind of elaborate on that and what these two earlier films meant to the South?
Sure. So the fantasy there is the idea that the United States is a white country created by white people and developed by whites and defended by whites in wartime. And to defend that fantasy, whites need to elide the significant role of African Americans in all of that history and all of our history, to take it out of the picture. And film is one of the ways that we've done this. And of course, film is a very powerful medium because more powerful than text in that way. So that's why in the book that this article comes from, I discuss film as a discourse, as a kind of a means of representation. Mm-hmm. And Birth of the Nation, as a really early film, cemented a lot of the racial stereotypes about African Americans after the Civil War that persisted in film for decades afterward. And it did that because Birth of the Nation also pioneered a lot of early film techniques that are still used. So it was an important film, but it was also a very racist film. And Gone with the Wind has a kind of a similar history. It repeated a lot of those racist stereotypes from Birth of the Nation, especially as related to the Reconstruction period. But it did that in a kind of a blockbuster film context that, again, was very powerful and very damaging. So what I remembered when I was doing that research, I came across an ad from the New York Times, and I'm sort of reading a note here. The ad in the New York Times, it was headlined, "3 movies about the South." And this is a quote: "The Birth of a Nation created a sensation in 1915. Gone with the Wind did the same in 1939. Intruder in the Dust gives the dramatic answer in 1949. So even that phrasing is kind of interesting. Mm-hmm. Previous films are called sensation. They created sensations, and then this is some kind of an answer. But there was so that kind of framed this as a third film in some kind of a discussion that was really sort of left unsaid in that advertisement, but that I think was kind of important for the South and maybe for the film industry at the time.
Yeah, Birth of a Nation is one film that, you know, we on the podcast, we actually talked about a couple years ago, and a lot of the discussion was taken up with, this is a movie that, you know, technically there's a lot of things that we're pulling from that is very important, but the subject matter is incredibly alarming.
Right.
You know, I at the same time, it's kind of, because Intruder in the Dust, just from watching the movie and reading the novel, it seems and Andrew made a note of this in our kind of questions sheet, but it seems like it kind of fits closer to films such as like The Night of the Hunter, the Charles Lawton film, or even The Kill a Mockingbird, that film and that novel, as these kind of I don't know, Andrew, how would you maybe describe that kind of side of the coin, it seems?
It's kind of hard to put into words. Mostly just the atmosphere of those films and the sense of racial animosity feels much more. Those three films feel like they are well-meaning white people trying to atone for the sins of the South in a way, whereas the Birth of a Nation and Gone with the Wind feel very much like they are trying to uphold kind of violently a racial hierarchy, and kind of make no apologies for the inequalities that existed in those times they're representing. But, you know, reading your piece on Intruder in the Dust, there were a lot of things that I didn't notice about it while I was watching it. The kind of the minimization of black labor in the South that kind of gets erased in the film was not something that I was thinking about while I was watching it. So there's definitely ways in which this movie is still being very much revisionist history, though it seems to be coming at it from a much different angle than Gone with the Wind and Birth of a Nation in my limited view.
Yeah, well, civil rights is a big context there. The Reconstruction period was a period of civil rights, and then the representation of the Reconstruction period in Birth of a Nation and Gone with the Wind was a kind of an erasure of those civil rights gains. And so to me, that's a thread that connects this film, because now in the late 40s, after World War II and leading up into the 60s, the civil rights movement of the 60s, there's again a push for civil rights legislation, and maybe the South is feeling a bit of tension and threat about that.
It seems like you kind of get into that a little bit when you talk about the filming of the movie in Oxford, Mississippi, because can you talk a little bit about the different ways it seemed like they were trying to portray, I guess, for lack of a better word, Southern life in a welcoming light? It seemed like this movie was an opportunity to show Oxford in this way that they wanted it to be portrayed.
Sure, yeah. I don't know much about why the studio decided to film there, but what I recall from reading those newspapers and some of the research after that, the decision to welcome the studio on the part of the town was controversial because of this worry, I think. And the novel is about race relations and the threat of lynching, and I think that the city of Oxford itself, not let alone the South, was reluctant to have that conversation nationally. So Faulkner himself, was not very popular in Oxford at that point. He's popular now because he's a tourism industry for them. But he was not popular then, especially after the publication of Sanctuary in 1931, which is about rape and portrayed the South and Oxford, it's, by extension, metaphorically, Oxford, very negatively. But that novel was actually one of Faulkner's first commercial successes, and so put its name on the map with that sort of negative stamp on it. So it gave the town a black eye, and I think those who wanted Hollywood to come and film saw it as an economic development measure. The town's mayor was a supporter. He convinced the local business people, the local chamber of Congress, that it would be good for business. He also owned the local movie house, so the mayor did. So he might have seen that as good for him personally in a business sense. But they did see that then as an opportunity to, I think, showcase a definition of a new South, which I think is, even if they accomplished that, it's problematic. But they maybe saw it as a second chance to change the conversation a little bit.
I thought it was really interesting in your piece. You had mentioned, though, that even though they wanted to seem very welcoming, even the actor who plays Lucas, he couldn't stay in the hotels. A family had to take him in. He wasn't allowed at the release party. So even the Black actors were being erased still. In reality, while they were trying to reimagine themselves.
Well, that's the sort of kernel of contradiction that I try to call attention to in a number of ways in the article, where they want to, in this case, they want to present themselves as a kind of a new South, but don't pay attention to that stain on the carpet, right? They don't want to air their dirty laundry when it comes to the racial history that's still part of their town and really finds its way into the film representation as well.
I guess before we get too deep into this, we probably have a lot of listeners who have not seen the film for themselves because it's sort of hard to track down at this point. So Zach, you want to give just a brief rundown of what Intruder in the Dust is about?
Yeah. So Intruder in the Dust is about, it kicks off with this character played by Juano Hernandez. His name's Lucas Bucamp in the film, and he has been found, with a recently discharged pistol and a dead white man.
Hey, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Can I interrupt you just for time purposes? In Faulkner world, you have to pronounce his last name Beecham. So it's Lucas Beecham.
Beecham.
If you want to start that over
Beecham
and do it that way.
Yeah.
You'll cut down on the...
Yeah, I mess up stuff all the time. We'll keep it in there. It's fine.
Nobody knows this except that somebody had a recording of Faulkner reading a story and he pronounced it that way, so that's the way we pronounce it.
All right. Well, Lucas Beecham is found, he is accused of shooting a white man and is taken into custody, and naturally the town all comes together looking to, lynch him following this murder, but a young man who and his uncle, who is the town lawyer, who also is Lucas's lawyer for this, start kind of digging into this case, and the kid and one of the people who works at his house as one of the housekeepers, and a older woman named Miss Habersham dig up the body of the person who is allegedly killed to find that body is not there, sparking this whole kind of, somewhat of a whodunit, but I think there's a little bit more to that just because of the nature of a African American killing a white man in the South. I don't know. Is that a fair representation of the story? As I kind of am pulling it off the top of my head.
Sure.
Now, so we mentioned that Lydia mentioned it a little bit, but there's a kind of a specific way that they portray Lucas in this film, and you talked about it a little bit in the piece, but Clarence Brown kind of makes some cinematic choices in kind of the light that he portrays this character, and this can kind of be something for the group as well. But what did you make of this kind of cinematic portrayal of this character, and how they framed and shot the character of Lucas?
Yeah, that's interesting. And I have to say, I don't know a lot more about the actor Juano Hernandez than you can read on his Wikipedia page. I think it's interesting that he came up through vaudeville and minstrel shows, which usually portrayed African Americans very negatively. And then he did acting work in films of Oscar Micheaux, who was an African American filmmaker making films for Black audiences, and as early as the 20s and the 30s. So I think he must have had a very intense awareness of the entertainment industry's treatment of blackness, and in particular of the black male body, and that's the central focus of lynching stories, after all. And so in terms of his portrayal, it's hard to know what Clarence Brown was thinking, except for what we can infer from what we see. But I think that, from what I see in his portrayal of Lucas is an effort to stand up to that history of racist representation as much as he was able to. And I think some of that comes, from Faulkner's writing. I know that, Faulkner, he did not write the screenplay, as you say, but he had a hand in making some revisions while they were on location there. And I think that he did make an effort to portray the character Lucas Beecham with dignity. And I think dignity can mean different things. I think for Faulkner and for Southerners, it meant patience and forbearance, and you see those words in the book a lot. But I don't necessarily that's what it meant for Hernandez. I think it meant more dignity in the face of that history of representation that he was very familiar with.
I do think he has, to a certain extent, kept it an arm's length in the film. He's definitely not the protagonist of the narrative. That would be the kid. What's the name of the kid of the lawyer? Chick, yeah. It very much feels like Chick's story, which is one reason why I was thinking about it in relation to Night of the Hunter and To Kill a Mockingbird, which are both, stories capturing what it looks like to, see the South through the eyes of a child. But there are a lot of shots that seem to reflect that status of Lucas as kind of existing at the margins of the narrative. Like I'm thinking of when Chick goes to see him in the jail cell at night, and like we can barely see Lucas's face, but he has like one big eye like coming through the cross-hatched bars of the cell. So yeah, like he does have that quiet countenance, that dignity, but he also kind of exists at a distance. And I'm wondering if that also is the case in Faulkner's writing, because Faulkner, I know, is so much about getting into the internal psychology of the characters and writing in the stream of consciousness style. You really feel like you are them while you're reading his writing. That is, if he's writing in first person at all with Lucas. Zach and Dr. Hannon, you were both familiar with the novel, so and I'm not. So can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I'd have to go back and look at it, but I don't know that he attempts an interior monologue with Lucas in the novel. I think you're right. You often learn a lot about characters by getting in their mind through Faulkner's really intricate prose style. But I don't remember many cases where he pulls that off with, an African-American character in his novel. And I think that, limitation, obviously, of him as a writer. And to me, the analog to the film is, you're right, that scene in the jail cell where all we see is his eye. And it's not just the eye of a man in the prison. It's that stereotypical racist, bugged, white eyeball, that's sticking through, that you see a lot of in this film. That's how, and that comes straight out of the minstrel history that predates the film history, and is itself a kind of a marginalizing and typing and erasure of the reality of a human life, into the frame of a stereotype. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting that you mentioned that he doesn't do a lot of first-person narration of Black Americans in his books, because I'm also thinking about Sound and the Fury, which is split into those 4 chapters, and the first 3 are all, very heavily first-person narration from characters who have kind of twisted perceptions of reality in a lot of ways. And then that 4th chapter follows a Black family, and it all of a sudden becomes third-person omniscient. I wonder if that's Faulkner trying to stay in his lane to a certain extent, or does that reflect a sort of ignorance that he has? I mean, those two things are not mutually exclusive, but I'm not sure.
It's interesting because I remember in the book, I think that kind of framing Lucas in the character as kind of this minstrel character is correct, because it felt like in the novel he kind of has that sense. He felt like a character, like a Black character that you would see that kind of shape. And so the movie was interesting because I felt like Hernandez was just so talented as an actor that he was able to bring a little bit more to the words than necessarily the character was given in the novel. In the novel, I don't know. It just kind of felt like he was just this African American character that was bouncing off the white characters. It never really felt like he had any kind of personality any entity outside of them, while Hernandez at least gave Lucas a little bit of something else in the movie.
Yeah. I've been watching a lot of Sidney Poitier movies this year, and I feel like he has a similar approach. He's often given scripts that offer him a very limited amount to do, but just in his facial expressions and the way that he reacts to people and his overall demeanor can kind of speak volumes about the character's internal life. And I can definitely see the same thing being true with Hernandez here, even though there's not as much for him to do on the page, or even he's not being framed in a way that puts the spotlight on him in many cases.
Yeah, that's kind of Sidney Poitier is somebody I was thinking about, in terms of kind of how his style of acting. It seemed more, while the novel kind of felt like it was almost like a Sammy Davis character or something like that. Another character I kind of wanted to talk about also, since we're kind of on that subject, was and you talked about it a little bit in your piece, but the politically active woman, and how it kind of becomes somewhat of a stereotype in the novel, in the film, in the form of this character, Miss Habersham, who her big scene is when she's outside of she's sitting in front of the jail where Lucas is, and this mob of people, want to get in so that they can, lynch him. And you have the kind of head ringleader, Crawford Gowrie, who's trying to get in, and is kind of prodding her to see if she'll kind of buckle at his strong maleness, and she doesn't. Do you mind kind of talking about this trope and kind of its life within the novel and the film?
Yeah, I think there's at least two things going on there. I think it's a gesture to the fact that women led the movement against lynching, in the early part of the 20th century, but that was an African-American led movement, and black women were an especially powerful force in that movement. And so all of that history gets transformed in this novel, in the figure of Miss Habersham, into the figure of a harmless old lady. So, that again is an example of eliding, the significant role of African-Americans in that movement and in American history. And it kind of reserves credit for all of that to the figure of this older white woman. So it's really kind of a succinct example of the problem of erasure that happens in a bunch of different ways in the novel. And then at the same time, the sort of second thing going on there is this referral to the code of chivalry that is supposed to define how Southerners act to other people, and that really means to other white people. And so the reason she's able to stop them from barging in and murdering Lucas is because they have to revere her role as a symbol of protected white womanhood, right? Mm-hmm. So that there's another kind of a seam of the racial history, because the excuse for so many lynchings was the protection of white womanhood.
Right.
In this case, it's not sexualized. So there's just a lot of things going on, but it is a kind of a referral to that trope and to that philosophy that is supposed to undergird a lot of action and a lot of behavior. But, we see really there's a kind of an internal contradiction throughout.
And it was one of those things where while reading the piece, I don't know. It kind of falls under the same category as is just one of those things that I guess I just was kind of missing when I was watching the movie, and it wasn't, I guess, as clear while reading the novel, but with the movie especially, that moment is so really they kind of try to make a whole moment out of it. It's a big scene. It's given its own weight, and so it is. It's interesting that they kind of. You talk a lot in the piece about the undermining of different classes of people. You also have kind of lower class whites, and you talked about how it kind of seemed, I liked the one line where you were discussing, as I could try to dig and get the firm one, but it along the lines of, you had these characters and these people who started as kind of lower class white people who like farmers and stuff like that, and they worked their way up to a point of high civility, and then once they get up to that point, they just completely ignore it and kind of forget all of those people below them, and I thought that was a really interesting point, especially when also you have this character of Lucas who is also a farmer, similar to kind of where those people came from.
Yeah, so I mean, in a racial sense, there's a propping up of white identity, but through the erasure of the presence of blacks, right? And in this case, just talking about class and whites depicted in the novel and in the film, I think there's kind of a similar phenomenon going on, where those who've arrived, right, those who've moved to town and bought their new homes with yards and fences, they are kind of projecting that as a new South identity, but that gets supported again by a kind of erasure of the poor white, from the rural area, and of course they happen to be the ones who are the criminals and the fratricides in this case too. So there's a kind of a marginalization in that sense in terms of class that's parallel anyway, a little different, significantly to the kind of marginalization of race that happens in so many ways.
Yeah, and the same thing happens in To Kill a Mockingbird in a way, where the Yule family kind of gets thrown under the bus as these demonized figures because they're poor whites. And
there's sort of that you can cast the blame for the racial history on this other, right?
Right, right. I'm reading a book about horror films right now called Men, Women, and Chainsaws that talks a little bit about horror films set out in the country, like Texas Chainsaw Massacre or Deliverance or something like that. And the author Carol Clover talks about kind of the redneck being made into almost like a scapegoat of like monstrous American sins, because no matter how low class or how Southern you are, you can always point to somebody else who's like more redneck than you. Like even if you live like up in the Appalachian Mountains, you can say, well, I'm not as redneck as these people like further up the Appalachian Mountains. So like it's a way to like continue passing the buck. And no, there's never like a concrete blame being placed for any sort of actual like historical ills. It's just all this weird abstraction.
In the novel, I haven't reread this section of it recently, so I'm not even going to try to paraphrase it. But there's a section where Faulkner is describing this phenomenon of the new neighborhoods and the picket fences, and I think that is represented in the film when Stevens and Chick are walking to the jailhouse, I think, and they pass a man who's watering his lawn, standing there, and they have a little conversation about the impending murder. And that actor who's watering his lawn is the literal mayor of Oxford, Mississippi, who's been cast in that role. And so that's a real kind of tie for me to this New South messaging that he was behind in welcoming the studio to the town, and then its representation in the film itself.
So I'm a little confused. is it that Faulkner and then Brown, by making the film adaptation, are participating in the erasure of Black Americans and politically active women, or are helping to point out the tensions or the spaces where they're missing? Because it seems to me like Brown was very conscious of the Black people not being in town, because he inserts that sequence where he shows them hiding and being very aware of this atmosphere of danger.
Yeah, I think it operates on a couple levels.
Okay.
So, I mean, one level we haven't talked about at all, it's not part of the film, but it's part of the historical context, is Black migration, for instance. So there are Faulkner scholars and others who write about the sort of absence of Blacks in, at particular moments in stories like this as a representation of the fact that African Americans left the South in large numbers in the 1930s and moved to Detroit or something like that. And I think I said Detroit because I think that Lucas's daughter maybe marries and moves to Detroit. I think that's in the novel, something along those lines. So there is a kind of a factual historical context about erasure. Now, Faulkner wasn't thinking about that when he put in a little detail about somebody moving, from Mississippi to Michigan. But for me, that's how texts work. It's how literature works. It represents a moment through the language and the structuring of story, and not always in ways that the author or the filmmaker are thinking about. So yeah, I mean, it's a more directly answer what you brought.
Yes.
It's really good. I mean, didn't completely answer it. I mean, it's a really good question. Can never be completely answered. So the characters in the novel, and this is really well represented in the film. Mm-hmm. Suddenly, it's Sunday morning, and there aren't any African Americans in the town, in Oxford. And so there's that guy who wants to get his shoes shined. He says, "Where are they all at?" Right. So I mean, it literally, that is what would happen, and Faulkner meant to represent that. But there are all of these other sort of layers of erasure that he would not have been thinking of, but are real nevertheless.
I was just going to point out a quote that you quoted Clarence Brown in your piece as saying he felt that the film was the most eloquent statement of the true Southern viewpoint of racial relations and racial problems ever sent out over the nation. And though I don't know the context of that quote, so maybe I'm missing something, it does seem as though the movie may be presenting the racism of the South in a way that almost does not comment on it. It's just like, this is what the South thinks of itself. And in a way, I appreciated that, just like how explicitly racist all the characters were, and like it does not attempt to pretend that their racism didn't exist or that their racism was not harmful. I mean, you hear our protagonist drop the N-word in the first 10 minutes of the movie, and it does not... Yeah, and the lawyer character, his dad, feels to me like a Bizarro World Atticus Finch in a lot of ways, because he does not come across as a white savior character, at least not in the same way, because he is implicated in the racism of the town, almost just as much as anybody else. Near the end, he's having a conversation with Lucas, and he asks Lucas, "Why didn't you trust your own lawyer with the truth?" And Lucas says, "You wouldn't have believed me. If I would have told you, would you have believed me?" And he just kind of sits silent, stunned, and the implication is no, he would not. So I think that all of the white characters are bad in this movie. So
the lawyer is his uncle, by the way. It's not his dad.
Oh, his uncle. Sorry.
Yeah. And this is just reminding me, I wrote a draft of this. The first draft of this chapter in my book was an essay that I presented at the Faulkner conference that happens every year, Faulkner and Yogyakarta conference in Oxford. And it's a really wonderful conference, and it still happens. And so I kind of put in a plug for that. And so it's a big audience, and I read this long 20-page paper, and it's pretty much the same arguments that wound up in the book. And And, it's a question and answer period. The first person to stand up, he was an older gentleman, and he said, well, I was here in 1948, and I don't remember it being like that at all. So I'm not calling that man a racist, right? But racism is around, and it certainly was around in 1948, and it certainly was shot through, the film and the novel and the filming of the novel. But we have these blind spots, and he was,
right.
In a way, a very nice man, but he was a kind of a practical demonstration of our blind spots, that we don't see it, if we don't experience it. And even, if whites, they're experiencing it on the side where they experience it as normality and not as a damaging kind of action against them.
Right. And I feel that there is a lot of mirroring of the kind of racism that we see today, and people kind of going out of their way to prove their non-racism, or trying to insist that they aren't racist, even if they are doing something that's very clearly racist. Like a conversation that happens in the movie is... the chick and his uncle are walking past this man who's making disparaging comments about Lucas, and the uncle says, you see, he has nothing against Lucas. He'll probably tell you he likes him better than a lot of white folks, and you'll believe him. All he requires is that Lucas act like a Negro. Now the white folks are going to take him out and burn him. No hard feelings on either side. Like, oh, this isn't about race. We're just going to murder him because he's not. We're not playing the race card. He is. That feels like a conversation that continues to get brought up today.
And that, by the way, that conversation is with the mayor character.
The mayor.
Yeah. I mean, it's the man watering his grass who is actually the mayor of Oxford. Yeah.
Right.
I'm Andrew. I'm glad you brought that up, because I'm curious. While reading and watching this, it seems like a lot of what's percolating in this novel, in this film, seems to be percolating today with, a lot of the current events and the rise of our current president. You talked a little bit in the piece. There's talking about this kind of celebration in Oxford for when the film was premiering, and they had a parade, and the theme of the parades was the New South, and that sounded very much like Make America Great Again. So it's been a number of years since you wrote this and studied this. What was it like coming back to talk about it on this podcast, and kind of reflecting on this, the novel, the film, and all of the kind of politics that are in play in today's current events? Well,
on that, I'll say that, like a lot of Americans, I am deeply distressed by our current president. And at the same time, I know that a lot of Americans voted for him and still support him and are not at all bothered by the things that I am very distressed by. And, as an academic, I want to say also I'm aware that academics today are targets for conservatives and conservative media. So any academic today is going to be somewhat reluctant to make very many public political statements, and I'm very distressed by that fact too. But I will say this, here's an example of something happening today that I will relate to what we've been talking about. You probably saw the news recently that the USCIS, right, the Citizenship and Immigration Services Office, where you go to become a citizen if you're an immigrant to this country, they changed their mission statement to remove the statement that America is a nation of immigrants. Did you see this?
Oh, I did not see that.
Yeah. So the previous, really the current hasn't officially changed, but here's how they're going to change it. The mission statement begins by saying that the USCIS secures America's promise as a nation of immigrants, and it goes on from there. And they're going to change that language to USCIS administers the nation's lawful immigration system. So they're taking out this fact that America is a nation of immigrants. And the director of that office, of the USCIS, is the son of an immigrant, and he's married to an immigrant. He is the personification of the fact that we are a nation of immigrants, and yet the mission statement language change is an elision, an erasure of that fact, in the same way that, the lives and the work and the history of African Americans integral to the identity of the country and the South are erased in the ways that we've been talking about in this novel and in this film. So, we see the impulse to erase facts that contradict our preferred ideologies. And this is happening today in a million ways under the current president. And that's, I think, what we've been talking about with regard to this novel and this film.
Yeah, I agree. Lydia, Andrew, do you guys have anything else before we finish up?
Lydia, I'm going to pass to you.
No, I can't think of anything else.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a good note to go out on. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on and chatting with us.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks a lot.
And that will wrap up this latest episode of Cinematary. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/Cinematary, on Twitter at Twitter handle @Cinematary, and on Letterboxd at letterboxd.com/Cinematary, where we post all of the movies that we talked about in this episode. Next week, we will be continuing our series, The Tennessee Auteurs, with 2010's seminal masterpiece, Jackass 3D. And it's not just going to be kind of Jackass 3D. We're doing this also kind of in conjunction with the Big Ears Festival, which is happening in Knoxville, that Andrew and Michael will be covering for the website. But we want to talk about Jackass 3D, one, because it's playing at Big Ears because of its 3D component. And so Blake Williams, who is a filmmaker who is showing his film, which is titled Prototype, that's built on 3D filmmaking, he is going to be coming on to chat with us about the 3D elements of this movie. But we're also going to be talking about, in probably part one, the Jackass series of films, because they're, Johnny Knoxville is from Tennessee, he's from Knoxville, and I don't know, we have a lot of thoughts to say about this series as a whole. So a whole hour of Jackass talk. We'll be talking about the initial two films and some of the third in the first part. And in the second part, we'll be having more of a discussion about 3D technology and that kind of filmmaking with Blake Williams. So please stick around for that episode next week. But until then, thank you guys for listening.